Welcome back to Last Records. Today I'm covering dumb grudges that started over the smallest things and transformed into brutal tragedies that you don't walk away from. From a man who booby-trapped his house with a shotgun, to a guy who tried to drop a 6-ton tree on his neighbor, which spiraled in the craziest way imaginable. It was August 3rd, 2014, and the dry heat still hung heavy over a rural property outside a small town in the high desert of Arizona, where a single-story house sat at the end of a long dirt driveway with no neighbors in sight and a back door that opened onto a gravel yard cluttered with tools and old truck parts. Roy Tedrow was 58 and a retired machinist who lived alone on the property he had owned for most of his adult life. He kept to himself, didn't trust the local sheriff's department, and was the kind of guy who figured most problems were his own to solve. His place had been broken into twice in about 6 months, and both times whoever did it made off with a bunch of his tools and, the second time, a hunting rifle he kept in a closet. He filed a report after the first break-in and basically felt like nothing ever came of it. No follow-up, no arrest, nothing. He was a few miles outside town on a dirt road, and he had convinced himself that deputies just weren't going to drive all the way out for a guy like him, so it was on him to make sure it never happened a third time. After the second break-in, a neighbor said Roy told him he had it handled now and that he wasn't going to bother calling anyone again. There was a kind of finality in how he said it, like he'd already settled on whatever he was going to do. The same neighbor said Roy got kinda cagey after that about letting anybody walk around the back of the house and would steer conversations away from the subject of security whenever it came up. I understand being mad that nobody seems to be helping, but in instances like this, the math almost never works out the way that they imagined it would. What Roy had done was rig his 12-gauge shotgun to the frame of his back door. He mounted the gun on a low table just inside the door, braced it so it wouldn't move, and ran a length of fishing line from the inside door handle to the trigger so that anyone pulling the door open from the outside would set the gun off into the torso of whoever was standing in the doorway. It was the kind of setup that seems clever for about 5 minutes and is genuinely terrifying the longer you think about it, because a loaded gun pointed at a doorway has no way of knowing who is on the other side. He aimed it at the one door he himself basically never used, since he always came and went through the front and the attached carport. Weeks went by with no break-in. The trap just sat there, loaded and waiting, while Roy went about his normal routine and, by every account, more or less stopped thinking about it. Then one evening, Roy came home from town with his arms full of grocery bags. For whatever reason, maybe because his hands were full, maybe because of where he had parked that day, he walked around to the back door instead of his usual way in. He grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The shotgun discharged directly into his lower chest and abdomen from just a few feet away. He went down right there in the doorway with the grocery bags scattered around him. The wound was catastrophic, and out on that isolated property there was nobody anywhere near enough to hear the shot or come help. He was not able to reach a phone or call for anyone. Roy was not found until roughly a day later, when the same neighbor stopped by after noticing his truck had been sitting in the same spot with the back door hanging open since the night before. The neighbor called it in, and the scene was pretty much immediately clear to the deputies who responded. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be a shotgun wound to the torso. Investigators found the shotgun still mounted and the fishing line still tied to the trigger, confirmed the homemade trap was illegal under state law, and concluded Roy had set it off himself by opening the rigged door he normally never touched. Because he was the only person involved, no charges were filed, and the case was closed quickly. The deputies who had supposedly never come out for him were the ones who ended up walking the scene of his death. Building a weapon to keep an intruder out and then being the only person it ever fires on is about as backwards as it gets, and I still can't get over the fact that he forgot it was even there. This next one is the kind of story where the person who came up with the plan walked away completely fine, and someone who had nothing to do with any of it didn't. It was March 18th, 2017, and a cold early morning settled over a quiet residential street in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, where frost still clung to the windshields of the cars parked along the curb, and a gray pickup truck sat in the driveway of a small rented house. Danielle Hoff was 29 and worked as a dental hygienist at a practice across town. She had been dating a man named Cody Maddox for about 2 years, and the breakup a few weeks earlier had been about as ugly as they come. Cody had ended things and started seeing someone new almost immediately, which Danielle found out about through mutual friends, and the people close to her later said she had been texting them constantly about how she wanted to make him regret it. A couple of them said she had driven past his place more than once late at night in the days leading up to this, and that her messages had gotten darker and more fixated as the weeks went on. Cody's younger sister, Bryn Maddox, was 22 and a community college student who had been staying with him for a few months while she got back on her feet and sorted out her own living situation.
By every account, she and Danielle had always gotten along fine. There's a specific flavor of breakup anger where you talk to yourself into believing that a little payback is harmless, right? And I think that exact mindset is where things like this start.
What Danielle decided to do was loosen the lug nuts on the front driver's side wheel of Cody's pickup. Her idea, as investigators later pieced it together, was for the wheel to gradually wobble loose somewhere on his commute and leave him stranded and humiliated on the side of the road, probably late for work and out a bunch of money. She came by in the dead of night, used a lug wrench to break the nuts loose on that one front wheel, then spun them back on by hand just far enough that they were barely holding, and drove off. It was the kind of plan that completely ignores how a wheel actually fails, because a wheel coming off at speed isn't an inconvenience, it's a catastrophe. What she didn't know was that Bryn had an early class the next morning, and that Cody, whose own schedule was different that day, had told his sister she could take the truck. Bryn left a little after 7 the next morning and got onto the highway for the drive to campus. A few miles in, at full highway speed, the front driver's side wheel separated from the truck completely and went bouncing off the road. The front corner of the truck dropped onto the brake rotor, throwing up a shower of sparks, and the truck veered hard to the left across the lanes. At highway speed, there was no recovering from it. Bryn had no way to correct it. The truck crossed the median and rolled multiple times before coming to rest on its roof in the opposing lanes. It happened so fast that the drivers around her barely had time to react. Emergency crews reached her within about 10 minutes, but the injuries were severe. Bryn was transported to a regional hospital and pronounced dead a short time later from multiple blunt force injuries. Investigators initially looked at it as a mechanical failure or a manufacturing defect, but when they examined the wheel, they found the studs were intact rather than sheared, and the bolt holes had been wallowed out, which is the classic signature of a wheel that had been running loose rather than one that failed on its own. That moved the whole thing from an accident investigation to a criminal one. A neighbor's security camera a few houses down had caught a car matching Danielle's parked near Cody's place that night, and once they had her phone, her own texts filled in the rest. She was arrested a few weeks later, charged, and convicted at trial. The friends she had been venting to in those weeks of angry texts ended up being part of the case against her.
She built this entire plan around getting back at a man who never even drove the truck that morning. And I find that kind of impossible to wrap my head around.
So this next one is different from the rest because of how a feud between two stubborn neighbors finally came to a head, and it all happened in about 10 seconds in a quiet backyard. It was October 9th, 2015, and a damp gray afternoon hung over two neighboring properties at the edge of a rural town in eastern Tennessee, where a row of tall trees marked the disputed line between 2 yards and the buzz of a chainsaw cut through the quiet. Garland Pruitt was 51 and worked as a long-haul trucker, home only a handful of days a month. His neighbor, Wendell Cobb, was 56 and a retired postal worker who was home pretty much all the time. The two men had lived side by side for over a decade. But the last 3 years had been consumed by a property line feud that started over a fence and just never let up. It had gone through every stage these things tend to go through. Surveyor disputes, complaints to the county, angry notes left on each other's mailboxes, the whole thing, and neither man was ever willing to give an inch. A mutual neighbor said the two of them hadn't exchanged a civil word in over a year, and that you could feel the tension anytime they were both outside. The thing that set Garland off this particular weekend was that Wendell had just finished building a new storage shed near the line, and Garland had convinced himself it sat partly on his land. He had come home from a long stretch on the road, seen the finished shed sitting there, and apparently decided he wasn't going to let it stand. Some grudges reach a point where the person holding on stops weighing consequences at all, and everything I read about Garland says he was way past that line. Garland's plan was to drop a large oak that leaned toward the property line so that it fell directly onto Wendell's new shed and crushed it, and then presumably claim it was an accident. He had a chainsaw and absolutely no idea what he was doing. Felling a tree safely takes a specific notch cut on the side you want it to fall toward, followed by a careful back cut, and it is genuinely dangerous work even for people who do it for a living. Instead of any of that, Garland just started cutting straight into the trunk from one side.
A big tree with a heavy lean is one of the most dangerous things you can put a saw into if you don't know what you're doing.
And what happened to him is a well-documented and often fatal phenomenon that arborists call a barber chair, where the trunk splits vertically up the middle, and the upper section kicks backward off the stump with enormous force. The trunk split up the middle and the upper section kicked back violently toward Garland, striking him before he had any chance to react or step away. Wendell had already heard the chainsaw start up, come outside, and walked straight over to the property line, where he had been standing a few yards from Garland yelling at him to shut the saw off and get away from the tree by his shed. That argument is what put both men right next to that leaning oak at the same moment. When the tree finally gave, it didn't drop neatly onto the shed the way Garland had pictured. The shattered trunk twisted off the stump, and the whole top of the tree came down across the property line, right into the patch of yard where the two of them had been going back and forth, and Wendell was far too close to have any chance of getting clear. Both men were pronounced dead at the scene by the time emergency crews arrived. Garland's death was attributed to massive traumatic injuries from the trunk kicking back into him, and Wendell's to crush injuries from the falling tree. Investigators were able to reconstruct the whole sequence from the cut pattern left on the stump and the final position of the two men, and concluded the felling had gone wrong within seconds of Garland starting his cut. Because both people involved in the feud had died, there was no one left to charge, and the case was closed. 3 years of complaints and surveys and notes on the mailbox, and it ended with both of their families burying them in the same week. Two grown men spent 3 years hating each other over a few feet of dirt and died within seconds of each other on the same afternoon. And I don't know how you even begin to make sense of that.
All right, this next one is a story where the plan technically worked exactly the way that it was actually meant to, and somehow that's what makes it even worse.
It was January 14th, 2016, and a hard winter cold had settled over a small 4-unit apartment building on a side street in a town in central Wisconsin, where snow was piled along the curb and the windows of one ground floor unit sat dark and empty. Curtis Lemke was 34 and worked as a line cook at a diner in town. He had fallen several months behind on his rent and had just been formally evicted from the ground floor unit of a small building owned by a local landlord named Hollis Brandt, who was 52 and owned a handful of rental properties around the area. The eviction had been drawn out and bitter, with months of missed payments, warnings, and finally, a court order. Curtis blamed Hollis entirely and never seemed to factor in the rent he hadn't paid. As Curtis moved the last of his things out on his final day, a friend who was helping him load the truck later told investigators that Curtis kept saying Hollis was going to regret pushing him out and that he hung back and lingered in the empty kitchen for a while after the truck was already loaded and ready to go. Spite has a way of shrinking your whole world down to one move you want to make, but Curtis was so blindsided that I don't think he saw anything else around it. What Curtis did during those last few minutes alone was reach behind the kitchen stove and disconnect the flexible gas line that fed it. His idea, as he later admitted, was for the empty unit to slowly fill with gas, reek of it, and rack up an expensive repair and cleanup bill for Hollis to deal with before he could ever re-rent the place. In his mind, it was a parting shot, a petty way to make the eviction cost the landlord something the way it had cost him.
In his mind, it was a parting shot, a petty way to make the eviction cost the landlord something the way that it cost him.
He told himself it was just property damage, just a mess, never once landing on the obvious danger of what he was actually leaving behind. He left the line disconnected and hissing behind the stove, locked the door behind him, and drove off without another thought about it. What he clearly never thought through is that natural gas in a sealed space is not a stink and an inconvenience, it is a bomb waiting for a single spark. Over the next several hours, with the unit shut up tight against the Wisconsin winter cold, gas quietly built up inside the empty apartment. The next morning, Hollis let himself into the unit to inspect it and see what kind of shape Curtis had left it in before listing it again. He stepped inside, caught the sharp smell of gas, and in the same instant reached over and flipped the light switch by the door out of pure habit before the danger registered. The tiny spark inside that switch was all it took. The accumulated gas ignited in an instant, and the unit went up in an explosion that blew out the windows, lifted part of the structure, and tore through the shared walls into the neighboring units. Hollis was caught directly in the blast. Hollis was pronounced dead at the scene from blast and burn injuries. 2 tenants in adjacent units were injured by the explosion, one of them seriously, but both survived. Fire investigators sifting through the wreckage determined pretty quickly that the gas line behind the stove had been deliberately disconnected rather than failing on its own, which turned it from a tragic accident into a criminal case. Curtis's very recent eviction, his access to the unit, and the things he had been overheard saying led investigators straight to him within days. He was arrested, charged, and convicted. The repair bill he had wanted to stick the landlord with would have been nothing compared to what actually happened in that apartment. The plan to make the landlord open a stinking, damaged apartment worked exactly as intended, and a man walked into it and never walked out, which is about the bleakest way I can imagine a petty scheme paying off.
Now, this next one really stuck with me because of how fast a dumb online feud between two guys spilled off the internet and onto a highway one night.
It was July 21st, 2019, and a humid summer night sat heavy over a stretch of highway running underneath an overpass on the outskirts of Houston, Texas, where headlights moved steadily below and a figure stood up on the overpass looking down at the traffic. Dexter Voss was 19 and worked at a tire shop. He had been feuding for a few weeks with another young guy named Trey Hollins over a girl the two of them had both been seeing, and the whole thing had escalated the way these things do now, almost entirely online, with the two of them trading insults, screenshots, and threats back and forth in front of an audience of people they both knew. Each one kept pushing it further so he wouldn't look like the one who backed down in front of everyone watching, and the threats kept getting more specific as the days went on. Friends said Dexter had bragged more than once about knowing exactly what Trey drove and where he tended to be. Trey's younger sister, Nadia Hollins, was 17 and a high school senior who, by every account, had nothing to do with the feud at all.
It genuinely unsettles me how quickly a pointless back and forth on a screen can put somebody on an overpass at midnight with a real plan to hurt a real person.
What Dexter had decided to do was wait up on the overpass late at night with a heavy chunk of broken concrete and drop it onto Trey's car as it passed underneath on the highway below. In his head, this was the ultimate move in their feud, wrecking the car of the guy he had been going back and forth with, the kind of thing he figured he could throw in Trey's face online the next day. What he never seems to have stopped to think about is that a chunk of concrete dropped onto a car at highway speed is not a busted windshield or a funny story, it is lethal, and he had no control over what would happen or who was inside. He positioned himself over the lane, watched the headlights for the specific car he knew Trey drove, and when he spotted it coming, he lined it up and let the concrete go over the railing. He barely seems to have pictured a person behind the wheel at all, only the car and the idea of winning. What he had no way of knowing was that Trey had let his younger sister borrow the car that night, and that the person coming up the highway was Nadia. The concrete came down through the windshield and struck Nadia almost directly. The car immediately drifted out of its lane, ran off the road, and came to a stop down an embankment at the side of the highway. Several other drivers who saw it happen pulled over and called for help almost immediately, and a couple of them ran down the embankment to try to reach her, but the impact had already done its damage. Nadia was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner attributed the cause of death to catastrophic head and chest trauma from the impact. Highway cameras along that stretch and a traffic camera mounted near the overpass had captured both the vehicle Dexter arrived in and a figure standing up on the overpass at the time, and investigators were able to identify him within a fairly short time. He was arrested and charged a short time later. The guy he was actually feuding with online, Trey, lost his little sister over a fight that had never really been about anything.
He spent weeks winding himself up over an online beef and instead ended the life of a 17-year-old who was just driving home.
This next one is the one in the video where the guy who started it all actually came out on top in the moment, and I think that's exactly why it's going to make you angry. It was November 12th, 2013, and a cold late night had settled over a row of modest houses on a cul-de-sac in a suburb outside Kansas City, Missouri, where a shared driveway ran between two homes and a work truck sat parked along the side of one of them. Ronnie Pelfrey was 40 and worked at an auto parts store. His next-door neighbor, Sutton Greaves, was 38 and an HVAC installer who parked a work truck at the house. The two men shared a driveway that ran between their homes, and what started as a small disagreement over parking and who got to use which part of the space had snowballed into months of escalating pettiness, blocked-in cars, notes, and shouting matches. Neighbors said Ronnie had been muttering for weeks about teaching Sutton a lesson over it, and at least one of them had noticed him eyeing Sutton's work truck more than once like he was planning something. Both men had complained to other people on the street about each other, and most of the neighbors had basically learned to stay out of it and hope it would burn itself out eventually. The thing that nobody knew at the time, and that turned a stupid neighbor feud into something far worse, is that Ronnie had recently started carrying a handgun on him.
Most of these feuds are just pure talk and petty little jabs, so the second I read that one of these two had started carrying a gun, I was horrified.
Late that night, Ronnie crept over, crouched down at the side of Sutton's work truck, and started pouring sugar into the gas tank, convinced he would quietly wreck the engine and cost Sutton a small fortune in repairs without ever getting caught. The plan was about as petty as revenge gets, and on top of that, sugar in a gas tank barely even does what people think it does, mostly just clogging up a fuel filter rather than destroying anything. But that one dumb idea is what had him crouched in the dark beside another man's truck at night, and everything that happened next flowed straight out of it. What he didn't count on was Sutton happening to look out a window at the worst possible moment, spotting someone hunched over at his truck and recognizing exactly who it was. Sutton came straight out of the house in a rage, and the two men ended up face to face in the shared driveway, every bit of the last several months of resentment boiling over at once. It turned into a shoving match in the dark, and the shoving match escalated fast, with both men yelling and grabbing at each other in the narrow space between the houses. During the struggle, Ronnie pulled out the handgun he had been carrying and fired, striking Sutton at close range. Sutton went down right there in the driveway between the two houses. Neighbors who had been woken by the shouting and then heard the shot called for help immediately, and some of them came outside to find Sutton on the ground and Ronnie still standing there. Sutton was transported to a hospital and pronounced dead a short time later from a gunshot wound. Ronnie was arrested at the scene that same night, still standing in the driveway when officers arrived, and he was charged with murder and later convicted at trial. He had crept over in the dark to pour sugar in a truck tank over a parking dispute, and he threw away the entire rest of his life doing it. Sutton lost his life over a stretch of shared pavement, and Ronnie, the one who walked away from the driveway that night, lost everything else there is to lose.
The man who technically won the fight in that driveway is the one who lost everything. And to me, that's the whole story of this one.
I saved this one for last because out of all of them, this is the story where the person behind it was actually happy with the result and then had to live with what it really cost. It was May 26th, 2018, and a warm spring afternoon hung over a backyard in a suburb outside Atlanta, Georgia, where folding tables and a big spread of food had been set out for a graduation party, and a wooded tree line marked the back edge of the property. Marvin Schuyler was 45 and taught high school biology, and he had kept bees as a hobby on his own property for years, so he knew exactly how they behaved. He had once been close friends with a man named Dale Reeves, but the friendship had fallen apart over a business loan between them that went bad, and Marvin had stopped speaking to him entirely. A colleague at the school said Marvin had become increasingly fixated on the idea that Dale had made a fool of him in front of their whole old circle of friends, and that he brought it up constantly long after most people would have let it go. The colleague said it had gotten to the point where any mention of Dale's name would set Marvin off on the same bitter story about the loan. Dale's son Tobias, who everyone called Toby, was 16, and he was the entire reason for the party that night, a backyard celebration for his high school graduation with family and friends.
Adult grudges I can at least follow, but the instant a revenge plan points anywhere near somebody's kid is the moment I hoped the worst for Marvin.
Marvin knew that one of his hives had become unusually aggressive and defensive over the course of the season, to the point where he was wary of it himself. His plan was to humiliate Dale by completely ruining the graduation party, so in the late afternoon, with the party in full swing and the sun still well up, he came up through the wooded tree line at the back edge of Dale's property, screened by the trees, carried the hive box right up to where the crowd was gathered, and tipped it over to send the agitated colony toward them. The bees swarmed almost instantly, far more aggressive than a normal colony would have been, and in the open daylight, they had no trouble homing in on the crowd. What Marvin had pictured as a chaotic, embarrassing scattering of guests turned into something far more dangerous the moment that box went over. Most of the guests screamed and scattered and ran for the house, but in the chaos, Toby, the guest of honor, ended up getting stung dozens and dozens of times before he could get clear. Toby, it turned out, was severely allergic to bee venom, and he went into anaphylaxis almost right away. In the panic of everyone scattering and trying to get themselves and each other inside, it took too long for anyone to realize how much trouble Toby specifically was in, and there was no epinephrine anywhere on hand. By the time someone reached him and understood what was actually happening to him, the reaction was already well advanced and his airway was closing. Someone called 911 and paramedics were dispatched, but the closest unit was still minutes out, and out in that backyard, there was nothing anyone could do to stop what was already happening to him. Toby was pronounced dead en route to the hospital, and the medical examiner attributed the death to anaphylaxis triggered by the stings. Investigators found the tipped-over hive box sitting at the tree line and began the work of tracing it back to whoever had brought it there, which would not have taken long given Marvin's known history with Dale and his beekeeping. But before any of that fully came together, Marvin, completely consumed by the fact that he had killed a child instead of simply embarrassing an old friend, walked into a station and turned himself in and confessed to the whole thing. He was charged, he got the ruined party he wanted, and lost every single other part of his life along with it. He walked into that night picturing an old friend embarrassed and walked out having buried that friend's child. I don't think a grudge has ever made a worse trade than that.